The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, bringing you Lecture 1C of our score analysis of Pictures at an Exhibition as orchestrated by Maurice Ravel. We left off about a third of the way in terms of page count through the movement Gnomus, and a lot of it was pretty much this kind of frolicking, ba-da-da-ba-da-da-bump kind of thing. And then the first version of bum 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 bum. All right, so those were the ideas expressed on the first page. Of course, differently than the way that we see here. And I mentioned before that where I left off was a good place to break off because it was just simpler to go over those introductory ideas, which would end up on the last two pages. So now, let's analyze what is happening from that point on. We have this lovely jump up, which starts off as parallel octaves, with that same rise of an augmented fourth that we saw on the previous page from E flat to A, that was under this bum 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 bum, right? So he's developing that material a little bit. Then here, it sort of resolves to a perfect fifth, and then it goes even farther, up to a major sixth, then minor sixth, and so on. But when it gets to this point, it's harmonized. You could think of it as harmonizing in thirds, even though there is a space of a tenth between these two pitches. Here we're seeing double flats, and you should definitely use flatted white keys and double flats when you have this many flats in the key signature, just to keep the fingering and the landscape consistent. You shouldn't just throw in naturals where they don't functionally belong, because that will mess up the head of the player. Just try to keep everything as diatonically consistent as possible, because that will help with diatonic fingering in violins and just the perception of it in wind and brass. Okay. So, it's a very simple idea when you think about it. It's just really effective because it is so staggeringly bleak. All right? Now, moving on, there's a reaction going back from poco meno mosso pesante, so in other words, a little less fast, but heavy. Meno mosso really just means not so much. Then, contrasted by this sudden burst of energy, then, once again, back to the same tempo, and really the same notes at the beginning, but then taking everything up a bit further, right? And it's not perfectly parallel. It's not exactly the same theme, only just played up a whole step. It really does develop and find its own way, reaching further, right? So, really lovely, and you'll notice these little footnotes here, talking about how the original score was different in Mussorgsky's version. And this has all been sort of tweaked around to sound more consistent by Rimsky-Korsakov. And, you can take that or leave it, but it doesn't really matter in this particular case because Rimsky-Korsakov's version was the one that was used by Ravel. So after this development of the theme, there is another brisk statement, which, since it is on different pitches from the original little motive, it helps to boost us up in pitch, right? So it's the same idea, starting from A flat this time, up an augmented fourth, and then resolving to a perfect fifth. But it doesn't get to go on and develop a theme like this. It's immediately interrupted. This sort of reminds me of that knock-knock joke, right? It's like, knock, knock, who's there? Interrupting cow. And then when the person tries to say interrupting cow who, then the joker will just moo right in the middle of it. So it's the same thing here. It's like interrupting cow moo. You could think of this as the trek of the travelers through the gnome's domain, and the gnome just jumping out from the shadows and scaring the heck out of them. And here, that when they really feel like they're going somewhere, he sort of stops them. And then he shows how his underground kingdom is just a plot to take over the world. That's what I see here, is overweening pride and ambition and malice towards the human race. Even though he really is just a little dude and, is about as dangerous as like an angry chihuahua. So everybody has these moments, even me, that, you just feel like you need to be bigger than you really are. So it's all right. That's fine. We'll just let our gnome be that way. Notice the interesting harmonic structure here of E flat in the left hand against E double flat in the right hand. And then E double flat is allowed to come out here, right? And so on. So the pathway through here is very thorny harmonically, but it's still beautiful. And it's actually a very simple idea. It just looks really strange in the way that it's written out, and because of the fact that we're in a key signature of 6 flats. If this were in G major, this would be actually way easier to score, and you would see immediately that a lot of this stuff is really unnecessary. But look, it would be even more confusing if this were in the enharmonic key of D sharp minor, right? As opposed to E flat minor. So let's be thankful for that at least. And it actually is a better key to score in for the orchestra, because the B flat transposing instruments will have a better time of it. B flat clarinets and B flat bass clarinet and so on. And English horn, which is in F, and also the F horns, even though they don't have a key signature. It'll be easier on them than if things were in D sharp minor. So this works its way down, and notice also it's a simple descent going chromatically against this sort of looping, menacing motive. And then they're switched around, right? We have the same exact pitches here. E flat, E double flat, D flat, C, C flat, B, and so on. And then the melody comes back in the left hand. Though notice, it's not the same melody position against those pitches. Here, we start from E flat, bum, 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 and so on. But here, it's E flat, F flat, right? Not E double flat. And going up to C and so on. So there is a slightly different scheme here. And I think that variation helps to keep the piece from being too predictable. That's great. So after that, we have this beautifully creepy little section here. And Mussorgsky did creepy like nobody else. Really great. And this sounds fantastic on piano, by the way. This whole movement is just really a great way to learn about painting a picture or having a narrative in your playing. A bit like Scarbo, as I mentioned in the last lecture. I love these trills here. As we're going to see, they'll be very beautifully interpreted in Ravel's orchestration. And really, that is the only thing accompanying the bum 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 bum. So this descends in its normal way, but gets a little bit stuck as the left hand ascends right up to this sort of punch you in the face version of it. And here the gnome, I think, is revealed completely to the hapless humans that have stumbled into his reign. And before they can figure out that he's actually kind of harmless and kind of cute, actually, he chases them off. And if you hear a really fantastic pianist like Evgeny Kissin, for instance, he interprets this so dramatically and so virtuosically that you just really feel, hey, this is a masterwork of piano, right? Instead of just being some bit of fluff that Mussorgsky tossed off when he had a few weeks off, which is the way that a lot of pianists have treated this work. It really does have dimensions in it that are worth exploring. I'm not saying that it's the greatest piano scoring like, say, Ravel at his height, but it still is a wonderful piece that's worth playing, I feel, in its own right. So one thing that we shouldn't neglect to mention here, and that is Poco a Poco Cello Rondo. One thing that you'll notice in the Ravel version is that even though it's marked in the score, conductors really don't push it, because to really go a cello rondo would be very hard on the orchestra by the time they get to the end. Now, it will be faster, sempre vivo, so definitely it will be faster, even though these notes, which we'll hear in the brass, are going to be slower and more deliberate because of the way that they're written out to be half the speed, right? And the conductor will tend to kind of move this fermata over to a degree. But there's only so fast that people can play this and still stay together as an orchestra, right? So Poco a cello rondo advisedly, okay? There might be a little bit more like Poco a cello rondo, rather than really accumulating more and more speed and more momentum, which you'll hear more deliberately in pianist interpretations. So speaking of which, let's hear the pianistic interpretation. So listen for all of those things we talked about, the very deliberate octaves here, and then how the gnome interrupts with his little motive, and then how the melody develops here. Once again interrupted, but at a higher pitch. When things try to get started again, they're interrupted, and then the gnome basically paints a picture of revenge and destruction and the supremacy of evil gnomeness over the human race. And then there's a very suspenseful section in here with the return of bum bum, bum bum, bum bum, and so on, which builds an excitement and is supposed to build in tempo. And then velocissimo, so with as much velocity as possible. And also very firm-fingered, right? Con tutta forza, so with all force, right? So you're just really going to push it as loud and as fast and as nimble as you can. So in my mind, this sort of depicts the humans running for their lives. Let's have a listen to that with piano, and then explore Ravel's orchestration of these same pages. So let's divide our lecture for the remaining part of Gnomus into 3 sections. So the first one will be that stomping exploration of the gnome's evil reign, interrupted by the interrupting cow knock-knock joke of the gnome. Then on the next page, we will cover the overweening grandeur of the gnome's evil plans. And then on the final two screens, we'll cover that beautiful and then the final chasing off of the humans before they realize just how small and ineffectual the gnome is. But starting back on Poco meno mosso pesante, so a little not so much in a heavy style. So let's take this from the stomping, okay? Because that's the funnest part. Notice that the harps are playing this enharmonic unison here of E flat and D sharp at a forte dynamic, which is marked up 1 degree from the mezzo forte rest of the orchestra. So that would take a lot of balancing, I would say. This is a bit of wishful thinking on the part of Ravel, though. If this were recorded and the engineers did their job and they didn't make this too obvious, then I think it would sound very natural. However, that doesn't really mean that it will work out, especially when you get to here and the change back to mezzo forte has not been marked, so the players might interpret this as staying fortissimo, some of the players. And then where's the harps? They don't exist, right? They're just too soft. Anyway, this is one place where I feel it's unnecessary, and it's also kind of tough on a harpist with shorter limbs to be able to reach this very low note with their right hand and then play this with their left hand, because you have to remember that the harp is resting against the harpist's left shoulder, which means that the left arm can reach all the way out in a direct line to the bottom strings of the harp, whereas the right arm, which you'd think would have more range, actually doesn't because of the way the body is positioned. So, yeah. Once again, going fairly low, I'm sure this is possible for the average harpist, but it's still not the greatest kind of writing. I really prefer that harp scoring like this should be mainly written for the left hand when you get below the bass staff. Interestingly, when Ravel was approached by a publisher offering to give him a contract to write his own orchestration manual, Ravel answered with a very modest reply saying that he wouldn't be interested in writing a manual about how to score for an orchestra, but he would be interested in writing a book which listed all the mistakes that he had made as an orchestrator. And a lot of people have looked at that and said, wow, boy, he's being modest. But you'd look at his scores and yes, there are mistakes, just like any other orchestrator. Like, for instance, the fussiness with which he deals with the sopranino and soprano sax solos in Bolero, which are easily playable just by a soprano saxophone. So he must have seen that and known that he had really gone too far in dividing the solo up between a sopranino sax and a soprano sax, that he could have just asked Marcel Moule or some other great saxophonist, look, can this all be played on a soprano saxophone? But he didn't, and so he wrote what is one of the most ignored instructions in his own repertoire, which is to play that solo on 2 different instruments by 2 different players. So this is not really what I would consider to be a mistake. It's just not the greatest writing for a harpist to have both hands playing so low on these low pitches, and also to throw them in a place where they really won't be heard very much, if at all. If you wanted this effect, it would be better on pizzicato strings, right? And if you want that, if you have this same idea in your head, really just make it pizzicato strings, all right? Because that will come through. Whereas the harp, it's debatable. Not to go on and on about it, but I just want people to realize that there is a consequence to this kind of scoring. Okay, but let's return to the timekeepers, the bass notes, including E-flat timpani strikes, and here going to A-flat, and gran cassa, bass drum strikes, along with the timpani, and that is really a cool sound effect, especially at mezzo forte. When you play one of these instruments at a softer sound than forte, then you can hear more of the character of the tone rather than just the push. Do you know what I mean? Especially with a bass drum. The bass drum can give you this emphasis, this kind of moving of the air through the entire concert hall. And when it's done at mezzo forte and lower, it's almost just like a whisper in the air, or a kind of like a push against your eardrum that's more integrated into the music rather than standing on its own, right? Which tends to happen as you get the bass drum's volume higher and higher. Now, all of these are just underlining the low E flats that are being played by the bassier instruments. In this case, the clarinets and bass clarinet, concert E flat rather than the Fs that are scored. And this note here is an octave higher than this bassoon E flat here. And then, of course, we make it a triple octave with the contrabassoon at the bottom. And this is just that really rich, twangy, reedy Russian scoring. And it's just beautifully interpreted by Ravel. And adding the horn in there really helps make it very dark, not just reedy, right? Without the horns, the texture here would be a bit brighter, but the horns make it darker in a really lovely chocolatey way, I think. Now here we've got some low flute scoring going down to this A natural, doubled by A2 oboes against A3 flutes. And it still works fine because everybody's playing, it's mezzo forte, nothing is screaming in here. I would say the clarinet makes it a little dodgy, but it's still all right. That A will still be kind of heard with a bit of flute texture in it. And as the flutes rise, they become more and more prominent until there's really no problem when you get to here. That is one of those exceptions, right? I really hate to see people score flute too much below C in the staff and expect it to be heard in thicker textures like this. But if the texture is going somewhere, then the flute timbre arises. Of course, sometimes it's just more practical just to have the flutes come in when they'll be heard, right? Which is what I tend to do nowadays. I just don't have time for that kind of long calculation, and the cumulative effect is just the same really for everybody, so I just try to be as practical as possible. As it rises, the flutes also become more prominent because the second oboe is dropping down, so we have one less voice from the reeds on that higher note, right? And of course the flutes become more brilliant. But these octaves just really are stark, I feel. They're just very nasal, they're very penetrating. The English horn, of course, is getting the lower note if you're transposing down a fifth. And the bassoons are going to octaves as well, combined with the contrabassoon, kind of going back and forth between what's possible, what's available, right? Obviously, the second bassoonist can't reach this lower octave, but keeping the upper voice just to first bassoon as much as possible. And that's also a very cool decision, especially in light of the fact that the two bassoons are going to have to work together in octaves to go back to ba-da-da-beat-a-bump, right? I feel like I'm doing jazz scat here because I'm not really paying attention to the actual pitches. I'm just, I'm scatting because this is one cool piece, daddy-o. Okay, so the bass clarinet is basically just doubling the bassoons, and then the horns are sort of standing here in the middle, right? And doubling the winds on their lowest pitch, which are these bottoms of the octave by the second oboe and second clarinet, but also with the second horn taking the role of playing along with the first bassoon, which is another reason to keep the second bassoon off the top line there. So if we have this doubling of first bassoon and second horn on the top of the octave, and contrabassoon plus second bassoon on the bottom of the octave, then it achieves a better balance as well. And once again, we have those dark colors. We have a dark color on the top of the bass octave and a dark color on the bottom of the treble octave. But the thing to keep in mind here is throughout all of these little calculations to make everything as perfectly in its place as possible for the entire wind section and the horns, It really is just 2 octaves, exactly like the piano score, right? So Ravel is keeping it simple, even though coloristically it's gorgeous, right? It's really beautiful scoring, but Ravel is keeping it simple, and that simplicity is what I feel is so devastating. So that simplicity is really maintained and comes back exactly the same as the beginning, but a bit of a bob, right? Same thing, no horns though. Then things continue on their stompy way, and if you compare these 2 versions, you'll see pretty much scored the same, right? The melody develops as it rises and explores other pitch relationships, but it doesn't really change in terms of what each group of instruments is doing with it, right? It's just really the same. And this is joined in, though, now with the horns. And this is not the easiest thing in the world to do for a low horn player, to hit all of these accurately, right? There's going to be not inaccuracy, but roughness in the lower part of the octave here. But seeing as how much it's supported by the bassoons and the lower strings and so on, it's not such a big deal. And also, with the contrabassoon taken out, which I think is also wise, it flows really, really nicely. Now, remember how the humans started to do their little journey again and then got interrupting cowed right in here? Okay, that is sort of scored the same, but what you have is the lowest notes possible taken over by the clarinets. So the first clarinet playing this written B flat going up to written E, and this low E here played by the second clarinet, which I think is very cool, very dark note, especially here when it's doubled from below at the octave by bass clarinet. Really chocolatey. And what is that note? It really is this very, very low D here. And that is going to sound chilling, especially with the way that this is more exposed. Notice that there's slightly less going on here than what happened before, right? It's more isolated, so you can really hear some of these sounds clearer. And I just find it beautifully chilling and very nicely constructed, even though it really is simple music. The oboe octaves and just two flutes on top. And here, notice how the reaction of the gnome, the sort of boo of the gnome, is taken over by brass, 4 horns, and first trumpet, plus strings. One of the cool things is that if you listen to these in a row, you don't really notice the progression of how the timbre changes. But the effect is that it is ferocious, a little more ferocious, and then very aggressive at the end. Just because of the slight shifts of timbre, which are progressive, right? You know, all winds and strings, horns and some winds and strings, and then all brass, which really is just the addition of the trumpet, and all strings. But notice there's also a raise of pitch and more strings coming into play here. Of course, here we're ditching the bass because that actually helps us feel like things are rising, and it's pointless to have the basses continue to climb above this F flat. Going all the way up to C flat here would be sort of ridiculous for them, right? And then if they were to double from an octave below, then it would feel like you were dragging things back down again, which is the opposite of what Ravel wants to do. He wants things to progressively rise. So that means ditching the bass, which also happens in the piano score, right? So let's have a listen to this whole page and think about all of those things, all right? I want you to try to listen for the harp, see if you can hear it. Listen to how you can hear more character from the timpani and the bass drum because they're not so loud that they dominate everything else. How they blend in and yet have their own voice, right? And then Listen to the stompiness of the bottom end of all of these sort of stompy sections. Those bassoon family instruments and clarinet family instruments. And then the wonderful resonance of this very simple but yet very devastating interpretation of octaves harmonizing with each other. And the horns in the middle, right? Then also listen for how the gnome's little barking reaction gets fiercer and fiercer as the timbre changes and the pitch rises. On this next screen, I just want to point out one thing, which is one of my harebrained theories, and that is of stochastic resonance. When people were working out how radio signals should be amplified, it was found that if a bit of white noise was added to the signal, it tended to boost things along the waveforms in what's called stochastic resonance. And my feeling is that this also works in terms of audio. So when a cymbal is rolled like this, at mezzo forte, given it's not really enormously loud, what I feel that does is that it contributes to higher pitches in making them seem kind of more resonant, maybe more screechy, more devastating, if you like. Here, even with this little mezzo forte, a bit of white noise in the background, let's be honest, that's kind of what is created with that particular effect. I feel that that makes everything just blaze. And we were talking about the overweening schemes for world domination of the little gnome that this perhaps expresses. I don't know. I feel it just gives it this edge, this biting edge, and works out wonderfully. And it almost feels like there is a bit of a brassy element here. But actually, what's going on in terms of brass is just the second and third trumpets playing this line muted here. Okay, so what is really going on here? Let's divide it into two different strands. One is the melody, the other is the descending octaves, right? Notice that here and there, Ravel compromises a little bit and adds a D natural rather than an E double flat. And okay, that's fine. It's probably unnecessary. The main thing is to keep the fingers of the players thinking diatonically as much as possible, especially the string players, right? So that they interpret things sequentially very nicely for their finger position, right? Not such a concern for winds and brass, but it is a concern if they don't comprehend things the correct way, right? So, yeah, so this is fine, really, just so long as everything tends to make sense in the order of pitches. So let's talk about that melody first. So it's very strong doubling. Piccolo on top, then A2 flutes below that, with A2 oboes and first clarinet. Then in the third position down, we have third oboe and second clarinet. And notice how Ravel preserves the big jump up with the grace notes. Bum, 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 bum. And then here it is a bit unnecessary to go bum-bum, right? So it's just bum-bum. And same thing here with the timpani. Bum-bum. Now, let's continue on with the melody. And you'll notice that when the lower brass take it over, it really is just a transcription of the left-hand octaves of the piano. And yet that's really effective. Sometimes you can keep things simple in transcription, and a pianistic idea can work absolutely beautiful for one or two instruments. And this is a case of that. I really love this big kick that repeats from the beginning that really just gives this first low melodic octave a big punch, and also coming from the lower winds and percussion. So now that we've looked at the way that the melody is realized, especially this, which is hugely beefy, fortissimo octaves in tuba and third trombone or bass trombone is just titanic, really. We were talking about bass trombone solos in the Facebook group just yesterday, and I feel that this is a terrific example of that. The bass trombone can be wonderful, especially in octaves with the tuba. Even though the two are really essentially different instruments in timbre, they still have a way of joining together in an incredibly emphatic way when they're exposed like this. So what is playing against these? Remember, the octaves in both hands change roles, change positions, right? So the accompaniment here, these descending notes from E flat to D natural to D flat and so on, those are interpreted by bassoons in these octaves here. And if you look at these octaves along with the cellos, then you're basically seeing everything that's going on, adding all the other instruments together, because the violas are essentially playing the top line and the double basses are playing the bottom line at pitch, right? So it really is just interpreting exactly what the left hand did. And the same thing is true here. The contrabassoon is doubling the second bassoon, and the bass clarinet is doubling the first bassoon. And it's just a progression down of octaves. But Ravel isn't happy to just let it be what it is. He adds a bit of portamento. So the players are starting on this E flat, and they're just slowly yanking down to the next pitch. Now, you can make this slower or faster. It really depends on the way your string section thinks and the preference of the conductor and what makes sense to the music. Obviously, if this portamento slide took 2 beats to accomplish, it would sound very off with the winds here. So basically what I've heard is a kind of a yank downwards. So ba, you know what I'm saying? So it really is almost like the push into the next note is where it happens, rather than going, you know, that would just be insane if you were to try to do that. And then the same thing happens here. And you can see it just written all out here. E flat above the staff, E flat in the staff, which is doubled by the violas from below. And we've got the same strategy here. Piccolo, an octave higher than that, and then A2 flutes, accompanied by first oboe and first clarinet, and then taking the octave below are the second and third oboe and the second clarinet. So it's a triple octave, but really only because the piccolo is on top, and that gives it a little bit of extra shine. If my theory about stochastic resonance is correct, somebody's got to test that someday to see if a bit of white noise in the background, say a rolled snare drum or a rolled cymbal, really tends to push the rest of the texture. I feel that it does. I feel that it does add something to it, just an extra kind of color to the rest of the instruments around it. And this is a great example, I would feel. So let's listen to all of those things. See if my theory of stochastic resonance makes sense to you, of just making the upper instruments feel all the more screechy. And notice how the melody first blazes above and then barks from below with these really prominent lower brass. Looking at that accompaniment as well, how the lower strings sort of nudge their way down, sliding down right at the end, going into the next pitch. And then the same approach is taken over by the upper strings, along with the winds, which, interestingly, I feel sound different, right? Because of the difference in function. So here you have like all winds pushed from below by the doubling of the second and third trumpets. And then here you've got winds plus strings. So I feel that even though the winds are coming back both times, they don't feel like just, oh, it's just more upper winds. That's just the same to my ear, right? That's something that I feel helps these two different phrases remain discrete from one another. So listen to all those things, and I will see you on the last two screens for the end of Gnomus. Now here we are in the most subtle and I feel most gripping page of Ravel's orchestration of this particular movement. Remember I was talking about the bass clarinet's capacity for creepiness, and here I feel that it has achieved maximum creepiness right here. And it is aided by those instruments around it in a very beautiful way. But let's just break down the exchange of trills between bass clarinet and bassoon, and then we'll talk about all the other elements that are at work here, which I feel are brilliant. First of all, this trill on a low E flat, which is going to be the same as this E flat here in the double basses. So they're just trilling here, E flat to F natural, right? And then we have a little chromatic rip up to a sounding A, written B, which is accompanied by the cellos. It says glissando, but it's really a fingered chromatic glissando. They could actually play it just as a slide with the fingers, but I've seen cellists play this as a fingered glissando. The bassoons take over that pitch, trilling on the A, which once again is the double basses, and then the cellos guide the pitch down. This is a really great way of dividing the lower strings because the cellos are far more nimble just simply because their fingers are closer together on the neck of the cello, so they can go a little bit faster and more precise over the same pitches, whereas the double basses finger positions tend to be much more spread out and harder for the player, unless they've got really massive fingers and yet very, very nimble fingering. Which can happen, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's some great bass soloists out there who could probably play this whole thing just on their bass. But it's better to split it up for the purposes of the orchestra. So really, lower strings plus bass clarinet trading off with bassoon, going back and forth. And notice here, when the little bump, 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 bump starts to descend farther and farther, so that the second bassoonist has to jump in and take that bottom note, it starts to crowd into what's going on with the first bassoonist's trills. You still want the first bassoonist to be playing this all the way through because it is the most nimble, most soloistic part. Let's jump ahead to the second screen of this part of the lecture, just so we can see where we're headed. And then bassoons rip up to this A natural along with the cellos, and you get this beautiful high trill on the basses, which is perfectly easy for them to set up just so long as they have plenty of time to get there. And as this is trilling, it's being doubled by these horn trills, which I think are just fantastic. And then everything just hits a wall. which we will talk about when we get to that particular part. So you can see where we're heading with that whole idea. And we still haven't even talked about the melody yet. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's see how there are little subtle notes of support here and there from muted trombone and muted horn. So here it says hauteur réelle, and that means the actual pitch. Now, that does not actually mean the actual concert pitch. What Ravel is saying here that this is new notation, which would have been a fairly new thing in the 1920s, but starting to be used over the generation leading up to this. So it's just a way of saying, hey, read this the same as you would read the treble clef. In other words, up a fifth from the intended pitch, right? So the reading is B flat, the sounding note is E flat below the bass staff, which is this same note here, right? Which is this same note there. And the only way that you are going to get a stopped tone out of this with a note that low is by using a stop mute, right? So just this would be stop muted, these little bonks, right? Some players can play stopping tones everywhere, but really it's a stop mute kind of situation. I would actually mark stop mutes on this. Here's trombone A natural. That is just hitting the beginning of this trill here. Okay, and it just kind of goes back and forth between those two pitches. And interestingly enough, that sense of pushing, that sense of accompanying what's going on is really given over to other instruments as things rip up to the final A and are trilled by the first and third horns. Right. Okay, so once again, we're sort of going into the next page. Now let's back off, and then this time we'll really take our lecture forward with this next examination. Okay, so we've talked about all of that and everything else that is implicated there. So let's talk about the actual interpretation of that chordal melody. So keeping it really simple, third flute has changed back to grand flute from piccolo. And bum 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 is doubled note for note by pizzicato in the violins. And right on the first note of each of these chords, we've got harmonics on the harp, descending, and a single note by xylophone, which I think is so effective. It's just amazing how much that one little note gets. You know, if you were to mark xylophone throughout this, playing every single note along with a melody, I think it would have less impact, right? But sometimes just one single note helps. And actually having the same pitch played by both xylophone and harmonics on the harp is also very beautiful. This can balance really well. If the harpist plays mezzo forte and everybody is really paying attention to where they're at, the violins are not plucking too loudly, and the flute player is really making this a beautifully precise accent and staccato and not really pushing too hard, then you get a wonderful blend of this harp harmonic and the xylophone tone. But it just really takes a great orchestra to really be focusing on that at all times. And sometimes even a great orchestra will not have the time to rehearse some of those subtle points, or they may just get lost in the moment as well. So we're descending through. We're still in the comfortable range for harmonics on the harp. But once it gets to a certain lower point, then Ravel just gives up. Because if he were to mark, especially multiple harmonics, but if he were to mark harmonics going too low, then they would become less and less effective, right? So once it gets down to these pitches, if you would have to hit a harmonic an octave lower than this, they would be ineffective. Really try not to write harmonics below the bass staff. Of course, intended to sound an octave higher. Just write in the pitches, if that's what you're going to need. Now, these pitches, like the B flat and the F up here, remember we're in bass clef, those would sound perfectly fine as harmonics from below, but it's just too much to think about. And especially as the music is getting louder and the delicacy of harmonics is becoming less and less relevant. Okay? But the harp can still contribute some, so long as there is a balance at play. Piano in the pizzicato, accented piano, against mezzo forte, that will work. Forte with the harps and mezzo forte with the strings, that'll sort of work. So there still is a bit of a balance here. Meanwhile, all of these pitches are being doubled by oboes, right? We're staying in violins for the repeat from below, but oboes doubling. Then as the music progresses, clarinets take over, which is very sensible as they have more control down there, with the second bassoon, as I mentioned before, taking over, and things are about to push up. So let's follow that. And notice that the bum this time is really spread across violas, first and second violins, harp, flutes, and oboes, getting bigger and bigger as the trill comes to an end. And these are all triple stops that are pretty well negotiable on these instruments. Notice that there's just a little bit of pizzicato right here at the end to kind of help underscore what's happening there after this trill in the cellos. Yeah, and it's just cumulatively building this, not necessarily climbing all that high. Really, we're only going all the way up to F flat here. It's not leaping higher and higher by octaves, and that is a good strategy because this scurrying ending is about to happen and we don't want to take away from the heights that it reaches, right? Okay, but coming back in here, we have that same chord here echoed all in muted heavy brass and stopped horns. And it has just the most flat, trebly, snarly sound, right? This is the gnome just really showing his teeth and his blood-soaked claws and just really trying to terrify the humans as much as possible before they realize that he's about the size of a koala. And we've got a nice roll here from the rattle. Then the snare drum comes in and underlines every single note that is being played throughout the rest of the orchestra. Ending with this big stroke here, short note on cymbal, bass drum hit, and E-flat once again from the timpani. Notice there's very little timpani in this entire movement, as scored by Ravel, but still very effective notes. Now everybody goes crazy trying to get away from the gnome right here at the end. That's basically flute, once again starting in its lower register and then climbing up to a higher pitch. I would probably score this with the flute coming in here on this A natural here, but it's all good. It's no big deal. It really won't be heard until about the middle of this bar. But it's always fun to get started with the rest of the players as you're doing something complicated like this. So all three flutes are on that pitch. We also have all three oboes on basically the same material. Not really reaching all the way up to this high G flat here, but still it's fine to end with this E flat minor 6/3 chord distributed amongst the oboes. And the clarinet comes in harmonizing it first, but then by the time it gets to here, it just basically doubles the same line as the flutes and oboes. And yeah, we've got the same exact notes happening here with the violins. Interestingly enough, this is all détaché, right? There are no slurs marked over this, but these are meant to be taken in one breath by the wind players. Likewise, we have the descending lines starting in the violas, joined in doubling by the cellos right here, and then the basses coming in at this point, then ending with some big harmonies right in here, pizzicato from the violas, but otherwise everybody else arco. And this is probably not too hard of a quadruple stop if the player is expecting it by the time they get there. And of course this double stop is perfectly fine because you got the E flat up here and then you just add the G flat below. Adding onto that harp, just a barking harmony here in the brass, and the bassoon sort of doing the same thing as the cellos as they pick up and come into the picture. It's interesting here that these seemingly random harmonizing pitches here are really just the same thing that's going on in the violas, and it's a way of giving them some wind doubling before the clarinets take on the function of the right hand of the piano. And notice how this is really effective as well because it's kept as doubled pitches on the same pitch rather than octaves, right? So it just has a most biting, most furious, most frantic kind of interpretation. And it's nice to see this every once in a while, but don't do it all the time, okay? Try to keep your functions a little bit more varied because even though this is a beautiful, brilliant, fierce color, it gets old really quickly, right? So it's still great to see this much doubling. So, all the violins, so that's about 30 players, plus we've got our 8 wind players on this note jumping up to here, and then the same thing's going on for the left hand. We've got all the lower strings participating along with the lower winds as well, bass clarinets, bassoons, and contrabassoon. So it's a really cool particular section, but don't fall in love with that whole sense of everybody contributing to unisons all the time, right? But this works really, really great, and it's a great way to show off your orchestra, how precise they can be. So let's listen to those 2 pages. Keep that in mind, how even though this sounds very fast and furious and intense, it really is just 2 separate lines where everybody is doubling on either line. Listen for this really shallow, intense, biting sound of all the brass playing fortissimo, muted, plus fortissimo horns as well, stopped. And then also, when this comes to an end, listen to the wonderful effect of trilling in the horns and basses together with the cellos coming in and then pushing into this reaction here with the rest of the orchestra. That's such a cool spot. And then, of course, where we started with the trills and the bass clarinet going back and forth with the bassoons doubled by basses and cellos. Listen for those little support notes from the low second horn and the low third trombone, possibly bass trombone, muted. And then see if you can hear the harp harmonics as they double the xylophone on the same pitch, along to the top line of pizzicato violins and first flute. Just such a wonderful effect, and listen to how it descends as well. And I will see you for our next lecture in a week or 2 with another beautifully orchestrated promenade, and what does it introduce but Il Vecchio Castello, with a terrific saxophone solo.